Basically, you said from a naturalistic standpoint, free will is basically an illusion. It's just chemical reactions that are occurring inside our head, which means that we cannot create our own meaning or even create anything. And so you said that, the works of art that we so much treasure, like Shakespeare, the Sistine Chapel, various movies, are just inevitable outcomes of physics and chemistry. So by the naturalistic standpoint, like we're all just, who said that we were just kind of bags of chemicals? I don't know if it was John Lennox or somebody said that. And so, from a naturalistic standpoint, there is no meaning in anything we do because it was just kind of an inevitability that our chemicals just happen to create.
Right.
I'm thrilled you're here with us on the Christian Clinician, where we join faith with evidence-based medicine to revitalize your health and renew your faith. Get ready for real and informative conversations with wellness experts and Christian scholars alike to gain a deeper understanding of our faith, explore our God-given purpose, and discover how the strength of our relationship with God can impact our health here on earth.
Welcome to another episode of The Christian Clinician. I'm your host, Dr. Tanya Paynter, and today I have the honor of speaking with Doctors Andrew Ike Shepardson and Melissa Cain Travis on their book, The Reconstruction Project, Recovering Truth and Rebuilding Faith. Dr. Shepardson is Chief of Christian Integration and Discovery at Valor Christian High School, and he leads the master's program in Christian apologetics at Colorado Christian University. Dr. Travis serves as Assistant Professor of Apologetics at Houston Christian University. In addition to being the co-author of the Reconstruction Project, she also has several other books, and the full list of both Dr. Shepardson and Dr. Travis's works is listed in the show notes below. She serves as a fellow at the Discovery Institute Center for Science and Culture and is a writer and editor for Shadowlands Dispatch, a Substack magazine dedicated to cultural apologetics. Welcome, you guys. Thank you so much for being on the show today. I'm really excited to talk to you today about your book.
Oh, thank you for having us. We're
Yeah.
excited to be here.
Yeah, good. So your book is called The Reconstruction Project, Recovering Truth and Rebuilding Faith. So the little excerpt from Amazon, what it's about, talks about Christians are capable of sharing their personal testimonies for their Christian faith, but find it difficult to answer many of the accusations that are leveled against Christianity in contemporary culture. And so you wrote this book to help answer some of those objections to Christianity, right? Like Christians are hypocrites, Christianity is anti-LGBTQ. So what prompted you guys to write this book?
Yeah, I think this book started with us being practicing apologists and philosophers who in our academic and personal ministry noticed that there's a gap between what exists in terms of literature and how apologetics is actually done in the real world. There are incredible resources giving a positive case for Christian belief. I think when we named a couple in the book, I think of ones like Douglas Groothuis's Christian Apologetics, and of course we're indebted to him for writing the foreword to the book. I think of William Lane Craig's Reasonable Faith, and Doug and I actually even wrote our own, The Knowledge of God in the World and the Word, and these are great positive cases for why somebody could believe that Christianity is true and rational. But when you're actually talking to people who don't have faith in Jesus, the conversation often begins with an accusation or a concern. And this is in the field of apologetics, we call this negative apologetics, being able to respond to the accusations against Christianity. And I felt passionately, I think, Melissa did too, that these concerns are often the chief roadblocks between somebody potentially considering Christianity as true and rational.
Yeah. And so then you wanted to have a kind of a guide for people to be able to answer these questions when they come up. Yeah. And you didn't go easy on the topics either. You're talking about abortion, you're talking about LGBTQ, slavery, like how God is kind of misconstrued in the Old Testament as this vengeful and vindictive God. And so you guys picked some of the hard ones. So how did you guys choose to work together? How did the collaboration start between you?
Well, it was a Holy Spirit thing, is the way I always describe it when I get that question, because B&H Academic had actually approached me and asked me if I was thinking about any book topics. Would I be interested in writing for them? I had not written for them before, and I think that they're an amazing publisher, and I had heard only good things about working with them as an author. But I was sort of at a loss for ideas. I hadn't really been thinking about a writing project. I was immersed in other stuff. And right about the same time, Ike reached out to me and said, "Hey, I have this idea for a book."
No way.
And I said, "Well, I wonder if B&H Academic would consider a co-authored project." And just a few months later, we sat down with an acquisitions editor at the annual meeting of the Evangelical Philosophical Society, and they loved the idea,
Wow.
and the rest is history.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Holy Spirit led indeed.
What I loved about working with Melissa is uh, she is such a gifted thinker in so many different domains. And I knew that there were places in a book like this where we would be stretching the level of my ability to answer at a scholarly clip. And I knew that Melissa could more than make up for anything that I lacked, and then obviously enrich anything that I was writing too. And so we started working together at Colorado Christian University in our apologetics programs. And of course, Melissa is now with Houston Christian University. And I saw that her strengths were just so needed for a book like this. That's why
Mm.
I came to her first. She was the first person I asked, the only person I asked, and I was very grateful to get the opportunity to write with her.
Oh, very cool.
And I could say much the same about Ike. My pastor, actually, my pastor is reading the book right now, and he said some really complimentary things about the book and how he could see its usefulness in all these different domains. And he asked me about my co-author, and I said, he's a brilliant philosopher who's very good on some of these sociological topics that I haven't spent a lot of time in. And besides that, he really helps me have more of a pastoral tone when I
Mm.
just want to say something snarky instead.
He's always good at that. He has always been good at that. Yeah, and you can hear both of you guys in there. I loved the blend of the philosophy and the science. You don't get many books where you actually get to see both ends of that argument, and I thought that was just so well done how you guys did that. And one of my favorite features at the end was how you would tie the gospel into every single, I won't say argument, conversation, topic. Like you would almost share how you kind of bring it back around to pointing people to Jesus. And I just loved that because it's so easy to get wrapped up in the argument, in the debate, and forget that after all, we're talking about just bringing somebody to Christ's family. So well done on that, you guys. I loved it. It was so good.
I appreciate that, Tanya. The truth is that for those of us who do apologetics and who care about these kinds of things, there is a temptation to stay in the world of philosophy, science, history, psychology, and to just enjoy the fact that we're dealing with truth. And truth matters, obviously, but this is a biblical ministry that is geared on commending the gospel to people. And I'm grateful that I was mentored in apologetics under Doug Roadheis, who challenged me, preach the gospel in every possible apologetic encounter that you would ever have. So even if I'm lecturing at a Christian college on apologetics, and I could rightly, safely assume that everybody in the room has a relationship with Jesus, and I could happen to be correct about that, we all need the gospel in every situation, every day. Those of us who've been following Jesus for years and the brand new Christian, the person outside the household of faith, we need the gospel. And so we're going to bring the gospel in everything we talk about.
Yeah. And for those who don't know, Dr. Shep was kind of my mentor through the master's program that I went through. And the one biggest thing that really sticks out to me from everything you taught me, it was just one offhand remark that you made about how just make sure whatever it is you're doing, you always tie it back to the gospel. Because I'd forget sometimes, like you get into the philosophy or you'd get into the science, you get into the argument and you'd get into all the evidence and you'd kind of forget to bring it back to that. So I love that. I love that you make that such a huge teaching point. So thank you for that.
This relates back to what we were talking about earlier concerning this being a work of negative apologetics, right? Answering objections. because one of the things I talk about in the introduction to the book is the fact that the apologetics conversation seems to have changed quite a bit in the decade and a half that I've been doing this. It used to be questions and objections were very focused on things like uh, science and faith, scientific facts that seem to challenge a core doctrine of Christianity, for example, and so on and so forth. Like, how do we know Christianity is actually true? Give us the facts and the arguments. But just in the past several years, one of the shifts I've noticed is that objections to the faith more often than not seem to center on whether or not Christianity is actually good.
Mm.
And so Ike deserves a great deal of the credit for the wonderful way each chapter circles back around to the most important thing, that being the gospel of Jesus Christ. The beauty of the gospel, like the truth and the beauty of the gospel. And so I think that that's one of the big reasons why the book, as we've compiled it, works so well, because we're coming at it with a holistic approach to not only the truth of Christianity, but also why it's so good and so desirable, and it's the best news ever.
Yeah, exactly. So who did you write this book for? Is it for apologists? Is it for the average Christian? Is it for pastors? Who did you intend to read this?
We wanted this book to be available primarily to students in the world of apologetics, but because it's geared for a student, we're expecting no previous experience in philosophical language or biblical studies. We want this to be accessible to that the college level average thinking Christian. So for somebody who never reads a book, it may be like a little bit on the difficult side, but for the average Christian who reads their Bible, who would pick up a book at a popular level, we wanted this to be accessible to that person. But that said, and this is, I was so greatly challenged and encouraged by Melissa through this process. Every chapter is up to scholarly snuff for use in a seminary or college classroom, so that there are footnotes to chase down, there are important sources to interact with beyond the text itself, where we'll show you how arguments have developed over time, where different counterpoints come into play. So there's great detail for the more seasoned scholar in the book as well.
Yeah, and I noticed that as well. It was really easy to read and understand, but there was a lot of depth there and a lot to discover, especially if someone is relatively new to negative apologetics.
To me, that's the best kind of book to write, because I love being able to translate difficult material in a way that doesn't dilute it or dumb it down, to put it
Mhm.
another way, but that also gives plenty of support to the person who wants to do the scholarly work, even if they're not a student. A
Mhm.
pastor who picks up this book and wants to chase down additional information on whatever the topic is in the chapter that he's reading. I want there to be tools there in place for him to be able to do that confidently, but with an element of convenience too, because we're all busy Christians doing our own ministry work, and I wanted this book to empower the reader to do
Mm.
what they need to do with these topics.
Yeah, so don't, if you're listening and you're a little bit intimidated by negative apologetics and philosophy, and don't be. This is a completely accessible book, and you will get a lot out of it, as well as having the resources to be able to dive deeper if you need to. So I highly encourage taking a look at it. So did you find that there was any particular topic or question that was the most difficult for you guys to write, or?
The chapter on Christian ministries and abuse
Mm.
was the most difficult thing for me to write, just in a spiritual, personal way. I'm, praise the Lord, not a victim of abuse, but I've seen it in my own movement in Christianity, my own denomination, and when you start to read the stories, you realize how much deep pain there is out there.
Hmm.
And that was one where the elders of my church laid hands on me, prayed for me while I was doing the research for that chapter. And it was one where I needed a little bit of extra care from the Holy Spirit in putting that together.
Hmm.
Now, that said, I've never been more inspired by the gospel than when I wrote that chapter, because you see Jesus himself becoming a victim of abuse, the
Yeah.
worst kinds of human abuse, in order to free us from the curses of our own abuse, to not only to forgive us for when we've mistreated people, but to provide actual healing, the deepest kind of healing, that all of our important attempts at healing through, various kinds of psychological and medical means that are important and real, they can't come close to the healing that can come through Jesus because of his finished work on the cross. And so I was so inspired by that, while still was a very difficult bit of content to work through.
Mm.
For me, there were two chapters that I found particularly taxing on an emotional and spiritual level. And one of those was the chapter entitled Christians Want to Control Women's Bodies, which is
Mm.
on abortion, the sanctity of life issue. It's a topic that I had done work on in years past, but it had been a while, and I had forgotten exactly how painful it is to
Mm.
tackle a topic. Um, I mean, there's so many things I could say about it, but you really have to delve into, the medical practices, if you even want to call them medical practices, you know what I mean?
Hmm.
And the attitudes, the callousness towards the life of the unborn and where we are. And, I'm about to say where we are as a society on this topic. And there's a temptation to say things are worse than they've ever been when it comes to attitudes about the value of the unborn. But the reality is, if you look back over history, the unborn and all manner of weak and vulnerable people have been on the receiving end of some really horrendous moral atrocities.
Yeah.
So, is it worse now? You're tempted to say yes, or is it just we're more widely aware of the moral atrocities in the world today than we used to be? So that one was, as I said, very emotionally and spiritually taxing. The one on the Crusades and the Inquisitions, I sort of had a a love anguish relationship with the process of writing that chapter. Ike actually contributed significantly to that one too. So that was one that we did more collaboration on than we necessarily did with some of the other chapters. But what was so grueling about working on that chapter was the complexity of the history involved.
Mm.
You're having to look at things from a sociological perspective. You're having to look at the historical context, the time and the place, and all of the strange nuances of warring factions, and can this really be blamed on the church, or is this really more of a state issue that was influencing the actions of the church here? And the list goes on. You've read the chapter, you
I
know.
did. Yeah. I learned so much from that chapter that I had no clue on, and now I have another thing on my list to study. So,
Yeah, 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 I could just keep going on and on and on
yeah.
about the complexities of that topic.
Really, we tend
And
to really make things really easy and superficial when we look at history, but when you really dive into those nuances, like what you guys put in there, I'm sure just skimmed the top of it. But
right.
I mean, wow, I had no idea that any of that was going on at the time.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And I am not by credential a historian, although I love history and I love digging into it. But it's, like you said, barely scratching the surface. And when you're barely scratching the surface on a historical topic, the risk you run
Hmm.
is unintentionally imposing a bias on the material, right?
Yeah.
And so one of the things that Ike and I both tried very, very hard to do in this book is to be completely transparent very painfully honest about the places where the church has failed, right? So,
That was one of my favorite things about it, and it really spoke to me as I move forward in my own apologetics and things, is how important it is to engage with the truth of where Christianity is kind of screwed up and where we've dropped the ball. And you guys did an amazing job of saying, yeah, there were some bad things that happened in the name of Christ, and that's not what he stood for. And here's biblically how this is wrong, but this is not what Christianity stands for, even though it was represented as such. And I thought you did that on almost every chapter and showed how the actions of Christians don't always portray what Jesus was teaching. Like they're not biblical actions sometimes.
That's I'm glad you took that from the book. We want to be clear-eyed about the fact that people have used the name of Jesus in all kinds of bad ways.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe not all of them are destructive either. I mean, if you just think about chapter 11, Christianity's anti-science. Are some Christians anti-science? Yeah,
Very much
some
so.
Christians really are and
Yeah.
have been. But that's a surface level note about the issue. Yeah, of course. Are some Christians bad? Yes. That's a very uninteresting thing to say. And yet, if you're thinking about how people often approach these issues, they're coming in with that surface level thing being a key objection that they bring into even considering the Christian faith. And
Mm-hmm.
so while it is surface level to say something like some Christians are anti-science, some Christians have been violent, some Christians have been misogynistic, we don't want to try to cover that over. We want to
Mm-hmm.
be clear about the scope of the problem
Mm-hmm.
and also the beauty of the truth and the solution in Jesus Christ.
Yeah. And we're called to be ambassadors for Christ, and we don't always do a good job of that. But then also we're always learning too. And, we all have things to learn about what Jesus taught on specific things. And that's important to keep in mind and not just lump him in with our sinful behavior. So, if we could, I'd love to ask you a couple specific questions through some of the chapters that you guys have out there. The first being chapter 1. So it's titled "Christianity is Unnecessary for a Good, Meaningful Life." I loved some of the philosophy behind this. So in your book on page 15, so right at the get-go, you say that there are features essential to a deeply satisfying degree of meaning that do not fit within the architecture of naturalism. So can you expound on this a little bit more? Give an example of how naturalism alone is not able to provide meaning for us as a collective species?
So I have read a ton of atheist literature over the years that deals with this idea of creating your own meaning in a silent cosmos. That's a paraphrase of how you often hear it described. It's variations on the same theme over and over and over again. And essentially, what they're saying is that we don't need God or any sort of religious belief whatsoever in order to live meaningful, purposeful lives. And then they'll go on and wax poetic in their attempt to expound upon how it's entirely possible to create our own meaning. Sometimes they'll even use the word manufacture, which I think is sort of a misstep rhetorically, but that's a whole different conversation. So, creating our own meaning, and we draw from that a sense of personal fulfillment, and this is completely sufficient. But the problem is, no matter how one goes about this meaning making project, if you will, it's always going to fall short every time because invented meaning, made up meaning, is not what we as human beings are actually after. Deep down, way deep down, we have this fundamental longing, and that fundamental longing is not for meaning projects that we can carry out one after another in our life. What this fundamental longing is for is a cosmic level meaning, a cosmic level meaning that's bestowed upon us as creatures and has no ending. So, in order to have the existentially satisfying kind of meaning, there must be a God and there must be an opportunity for us to live in communion with our Creator God forever. And the atheist or agnostic meaning making projects never get you anywhere remotely close to that level of meaning, what I'm calling this cosmic level meaning. And so those sorts of projects are doomed from the get-go, and they just can't provide this big essential for human flourishing.
Hmm. And part of this chapter, you also go into the naturalistic view of free will as well, which I think really ties into that meaning making as well. That I love. So basically, you said from a naturalistic standpoint, free will is basically an illusion. It's just chemical reactions that are occurring inside our head, which means that we cannot create our own meaning or even create anything. And so you said that, the works of art that we so much treasure, like Shakespeare, the Sistine Chapel, various movies, are just inevitable outcomes of physics and chemistry. So by the naturalistic standpoint, like we're all just who said that we were just kind of bags of chemicals? I don't know if it was John Lennox or somebody said that. And so, from a naturalistic standpoint, there is no meaning in anything we do because it was just kind of an inevitability that our chemicals just happen to create.
Right. We're just automatons, to use the old-fashioned word.
I always
We're,
liked meat machines.
Meat machines, yeah, another one. Yep, meat machines. We just do what we're programmed to do, and we have no choice.
yeah, Richard Dawkins calls it dancing to the tune of our DNA.
Yeah, right. So how does naturalism then provide for, do they provide at all for the idea of free will? I mean, do they think that there is any free will, or are we all just predetermined to do what we're programmed to do based off of the chemical reactions that are happening?
Well, maybe I'll take this and then Melissa catch everything I don't get here. But was something that's important to keep in mind. And Tanya, you know this as my student. It's important to understand that the naturalistic worldview is a closed system. And in that system, you have cause and effect. And for human beings, biology and chemistry, chance and necessity, uh, plus nothing. And so what that means is that all of our decisions, so-called, all of our actions are predetermined by antecedent factors over which we have no control. I don't control my genes. I don't control the accidents of which chromosomes I have, or other things that have happened to me that causes antecedent causes that have had their effect in my life. Given that I have no control over them, then I cannot act other than I do. I'm constrained by my biology, my chemistry, by chance and necessity, these causal factors over which I have no control.
Did you have anything to add, Melissa?
I keep thinking about this quote from atheist cosmologist Sean Carroll that I love so much. I'm going to tell you, those of you out there who don't read atheist literature, you're really missing out because you find some glorious gems in their writing. And this particular quote that I keep thinking of is where Sean Carroll very honestly says, there is no such thing as free will. And, he's a scientific materialist. He gives all of the reasons why there cannot be genuine free will on his worldview. He says it would have to be possible for Christians to not, I'm sorry, not Christians. It would have to be possible for people to defy the laws of physics just by thinking. And what I love about that is he's explaining why on scientific materialism, you cannot possibly get any kind of free will, but he takes it even a step further and relates it to our thought processes. So not only can we not uh, do anything we want, we can only do what's dictated by material cause and effect, and we cannot even choose what we desire to do because our desires are the product of material cause and effect. But even our very rationality is dictated by material cause and effect. And what that essentially says is there is not only is there no such thing as free will, there's no such thing as genuine rationality either.
Yeah.
But yet, these very same scientific materialists are champions of the scientific enterprise, which they would never deny is fundamentally rational. So they're caught in this vicious circle of, well, they're sawing off the branch that they're trying to sit upon.
Yeah.
And so it's just at very bottom, it's an incoherent worldview.
Yeah. And even Charles Darwin, when he was talking about his theory of evolution, had that same thought. It's like, well, how can I trust my thought if I'm just an evolved monkey brain,
Yeah,
essentially?
right. Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Darwin's doubt.
Yep. Yeah. Um, so then in chapter two, you have God and human suffering, basically the gist of it. This isn't the title, but God and human suffering are incompatible. And this is such a common objection is why God didn't just create a world where everyone chooses good. And so we just got done talking about free will, and this question kind of essentially brings up free will again. So what do you guys have to say on the topic that why doesn't God just choose to stop the most horrendous evils? Why does he, allow things like torture of children and child abuse and things like that to happen, even if he lets some of the lesser evils go?
One of the things to keep in mind is that we know some of why God allows evil. We're aware of the fact that God allows evil for the existence of greater goods. There are some things that would not obtain if we weren't in a world with at least some amount of evil in it. So I think about virtues like courage, patience. These things are goods, objective goods that only come about in a world with some kind of evil and opposition, suffering as well. We also know that free will is a means of all kinds of greater goods as well. I mean, in particular, if you think about the relationship between a lover and the beloved, a lover has love for a beloved, and the best kind of love is when a beloved can reciprocate, which means some kind of power of contrary choice, which is some of what's involved with a libertarian view of free will. And so when the beloved can say back to the lover, I love you too, that allows so much more aggregate good in a world that would then also, because of the existence of free will, allow quite a bit of evil and suffering as well. So we know part of the answer. But your question in particular, I think, is a really good one, Tanya, is why so much? And why the worst kinds of evil? And this is where we have to ask whether or not we're in a cognitive position to really understand all of God's justifying reasons for allowing so much evil. Are we capable of knowing all of what God has in God's mind for allowing so much evil? And this is where it seems like it'd be difficult if we could ever know that.
Mm.
It's not that we just don't happen to know, it's that it may be impossible for us ever to know all of God's justifying reasons. We may not actually have cognitive access to all of what those reasons could possibly be.
So then how would you answer somebody who says, well, I don't care to follow a God who lets these types of things happen? What would be your response to that?
Well, I think Ike's point about the fact that we're not omniscient, and we can't know the mind of God or, what God's grander project is in terms of allowing evils for greater goods. That kind of statement just strikes me as thoroughly prideful, for one thing. Um, and if I could just circle back to piggyback off some of the things that Ike was just saying, I think related to your original question, that is, I think that essentially when someone's asking, why does God allow so much evil or such horrendous evils? Uh, what they're essentially asking is, why doesn't God curtail free will in some instances, at least? And it's kind of a situation of wanting to have your cake and eat it too. Like, we want libertarian free will for a whole variety of reasons, but we want God to curtail some people's free will in some circumstances in order to prevent the most horrendous evils. And I think it's a problematic way to come at the issue. I had this wonderful professor in graduate school in my master's program who taught the problem of evil course.
Mm.
And I thought he made a really interesting point about this. He said, okay, imagine a hypothetical world in which you could say to God, okay, I don't like evil A, B, and C, and I want you to prevent those, but I understand if you need to allow the rest to carry on for some sort of greater good. The problem with that is if evils A, B, and C were eliminated, then all of a sudden evils D, E, and F would become our horrendous
The
evils. And
greatest
we would
evils.
ask God, why are you not preventing evils D, E, and F?
Mm.
And so on it would go because as human beings, we are wired in such a way by design to abhor evil in various forms, right? And so the presence of any evil whatsoever is going to be abrasive to our sensibilities. And so the question this professor would ask is, well, where does it stop and who would
Mm.
get to decide at what point God has eliminated enough of the evil in the world? And I think that makes for a really interesting conversation with someone who wants to make the kind of objection that you're talking about. Well, why
Mm.
doesn't God at least eliminate this subset of evils in the world?
We always have to
And,
have a most objectionable evil.
Right.
and we have to be clear that for the person who wants to reject belief in God because of the existence of evil, there's actually a problem there. Most people have some kind of experience of an understanding of the existence of evil. But this is actually for the Christian a point of contact with the non-believer. And it's something in a materialistic universe that doesn't make sense. When you say that something is evil, something like, let's say, holocausts are evil, you're actually making an objective moral claim. And that objective moral claim is undercut by the subjectivity of a meaningless, moralist universe. So, all the atheist can do in saying that holocausts are evil is say that from my subjective perspective, I think holocausts are evil. But what the atheist cannot say is that for all peoples at all times, in an objective sense, holocausts are evil. Because all you have to do is say, says who? What makes a Holocaust evil? By what authority are you claiming that all holocausts for all peoples at all times are evil? From a Christian perspective, it's very clear that holocausts are evil because we have a universe in which there's an objective moral lawgiver who sits above all peoples and all times and can render objective moral judgments and then has the ability to reveal them to rational creatures. And by the way, because these rational creatures are not just meat machines, but we're made in the image of God, we can have access to divine revelation. Thereby, we can make claims such as holocausts are objectively evil. The atheist doesn't benefit from any of that objectivity.
A
That's
question that I like to ask in those kinds of conversations is very, very simply, where are you getting your good? Because clearly you're making a moral judgment. And in order to do that, you have to have some sort of standard that transcends a standard of goodness, whereby the thing in question either aligns or falls short. And so to just ask, where are you getting your good? And oftentimes they'll default to something like, my idea of the good is the situation in which human beings collectively can best flourish. And so then you end up really having to challenge, well, what does it mean for a human being to flourish? Well, what is a human being? What is human nature? So it opens up all sorts of, I think, really potentially fruitful avenues of conversation.
mm. And I often hear, well, what society kind of comes up with their own. Society comes up with
Yeah.
what's right and what's wrong. And it's like, okay, well, Whereas society, like that's an agreement, a bunch of group of people, and yet we see that Christianity is influencing the societal decisions of what's good and what's not. So again, it still ties back to God as the moral lawgiver.
But
Right.
all you have to do is you have to have the potential existence of a society that affirms all kinds of horrendous evils as objectively good. So you could very easily imagine a culture in which it's common to, let's say, murder one's parents or to eat one's children. And of course, these are horrendous things to say, but let's just paint a picture of a potential society that engages in the worst kinds of evil. You would have to admit, if society is the basis for your understanding of good and evil, that that particular society is doing what is morally permissible. If there isn't an objective standard by which you can measure goods and evils over time and transculturally, then you have to admit Ted Bundy and Mother Teresa, morally equivalent. You have to
Mm,
say this terrible society that I just described, and a society that cares for children and honors the elderly. These are morally equivalent cultures. Who's to say which society has it better? Well, of course we know which society has it better. It's the ones that do justice and love mercy and walk humbly with their God. And the society that rejects all those things is morally evil.
yeah, so many good approaches to that, as you said, Melissa. Like there's a lot of ways to answer that. We have time for one other question, I think. And I really wanted to talk about chapters 4 and 5, which were Christian ministries are abusive and Christianity is misogynistic, because I hear, again, those are very, very common. And so as we talked about earlier, starting in chapter 3, you guys really did a really good job of showing how Christianity is not always representative of biblical standards. And then in chapter 4, you're discussing the abuses seen in Christian ministry, something you mentioned earlier, Dr. Shep. And so you specifically covered the objection that Christian patriarchy has led to mistreatment of women over the centuries. But you do a wonderful job of correcting what the Bible actually teaches about the value of women. And so I was wondering if you could give a couple of examples of ways that Jesus showed his value of women in his creation, as we wrap this conversation up.
Well, one of the most important ways that Jesus values women is his relationship with his mother. Uh, the fact that the eternal Son, in concert with the Father and the Spirit, decided that the incarnation would take place in the womb of a human woman. It's certainly within God's power and God's ability to create a human being ex nihilo. He's done it before. He could have done it again. And yet God chooses to partner with a woman. I think this is incredibly dignifying to women.
Mm.
And Mary, for this reason, is held up as a hero of faith, because we're given the opportunity to see how to respond to the work of the Messiah first, in how a woman responds to the word of God given to her about the Messiah. And Mary's answer is indicative of what ours should be. Let it be done unto me according to thy word. She just opens up her heart to say yes. And Francis Schaeffer calls this an active passivity.
Mm.
A way that he describes it in other places is opening the empty hands of faith. She simply just says yes to God. And I can't think of a better hero of faith for me and for my son and for my daughters. I can't think of a better way to respond to the work of God than to simply just say yes.
Mm.
Now, this is important, though, because our first example of how to deal with the Messiah is given to us not through a male prophet, not through some important Jewish religious figure who may have at the time just easily been male, but through a woman. I love this about God.
I love the episode in John chapter 4 where Jesus meets with the Samaritan woman at Jacob's well. There is something about that account that never ceases to captivate me, um, for so many reasons. I always ask the question, what was her name? Why doesn't John tell us what her name was?
Yeah.
But my point here is that we have Christ approaching a woman, and his approach of her breaks down gender norms of the time.
Mhm.
It breaks down racial barriers of that time and place. And what ends up happening is that he sends this woman off to essentially be the very first evangelist for the Messiah. She goes and she evangelizes her town. She tells them the good news of the incarnation of Jesus. And then in Luke 24, we get the very first resurrection appearance. So Jesus, in his glorified state, does what? He appears first to three women. And what happens then? They get to go off and be the first to proclaim the gospel to a group of men that don't even believe them at first. So these are probably my favorite two episodes where Jesus demonstrates the great value he places on women as human beings and the very special ways that he commissioned women, not only during his earthly ministry, but right after his resurrection.
And
Yeah.
this is what's so beautiful about the work of God, because this could very easily just be another commentary in our modern Western politics of gender, where it's, well, men have, they've, of course, and this is, of course, true, repressed women in various ways over time. The church maybe at different times has been complicit in this. And, well, we need to set the record straight. What you see in the Bible is God confounding our politics of gender.
Mm.
God isn't about evening the scales or settling the score. God is about offering all of humanity, male and female, an opportunity to equally come to the foot of the cross, be humbled, and then, of course, be exalted because of the finished work of Jesus Christ. This is what I think you could very easily miss, is that we're just engaging in the gender debate. And that's probably the most boring book that you actually don't really want to read. And I'm not saying that the gender debate is unimportant. In fact, we talk about how there are genuine disagreements among Christians about the nature of women in leadership ministry
Mhm.
and how a man and a woman are to obey the scripture to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. We address that there are different ways to look at this, and of course we have our own opinions. But before Jesus, it relativizes this conflict a little bit because of how God humbles us and exalts us through his finished work.
Yeah. And what really spoke to me in those chapters was the point that you made, Melissa, about I'd never really thought about the fact that the very first people that got to proclaim the gospel were the women. Like I never really, I mean, to me it was just they were reporting that Jesus empty tomb, but that was literally the gospel. Like they got to go share that first, and that just really spoke to me. I loved that. So I hear rumor that there may be a companion to this book. Is there any truth to that?
We want the companion to this book to be any any positive apologetics book that you find to be helpful and useful. Now, I of course have my own axe to grind on this, in that I think that a great one is the one I co-wrote with Doug Roadheis, The Knowledge of God in the World and the Word, which gives a positive case for the truth and rationality of Christianity. But like we mentioned before, Christian apologetics, Scaling the Secular City is a great one by J.P. Moreland. Reasonable Faith or On Guard by William Lane Craig. There's these wonderful works in positive apologetics. We just want this to be kind of a companion to be read alongside those kinds of works.
Great. So it'd be a good resource to use in combination. So you get kind of both sides.
Yeah, yeah. One of my very favorite things about this book is that these chapters really can function in a standalone manner. So someone doesn't have to sit down and read this book cover to cover to really benefit from it.
Mm.
They can sit down and they can read the section of chapters that pertains directly to whatever the objection is that they're currently dealing with. And then, as we talked about earlier in our conversation, there are footnotes to guide them in delving even deeper. So I look at this book as a springboard library staple, if I could describe it that way. Something really valuable to have on your shelf, your first your first measure of attack when it comes to one of these, and I don't mean attack against the person. You guys know what I mean. Your
We
first
knew what you meant.
ideological attack when an objection is raised.
Yeah.
But then it gives you, as I said, avenues for further research. Um, but I just love that you don't have to commit to the whole book at once. I
Hmm.
think we're, especially us who are in education, like Ike and I are. We're fighting with these shorter and shorter attention spans of our students. And so I don't want to cater to that by any means, but I do like that it takes some of the intimidation factor out to be able to say, hey, if you just need a chapter here and there, this is a great book for you.
Yeah, and especially for someone who's just trying to get into apologetics and all of that, I frequently handle questions about, what resources should I go to? And this would be a wonderful one because a lot of times people are asking those questions because they have people in their lives that are struggling with a particular thing like LGBTQ or, women's rights or abortion or something like that. And so this could be a wonderful way to start that learning process, learn some of the basics, and then you have those resources available to dive deeper if that's something that person needs to pursue a little bit more. So that's a great way to use it instead of thinking about I have to read it cover to cover. It's like a dictionary of apologetics that you can go to. So where can somebody who's interested in reading the book, where can they find you guys? Where can they find the book?
Yeah, they can find me at Shepardson.com. The book's available Amazon, Barnes and Noble, the Lifeway.com website, anywhere you'd buy a book. And then you can see, if you look into Valor Christian High School and Colorado Christian University, those are the key places where I'm posted these days.
Wonderful. And for you, Dr. Travis?
Yeah, so I actually do have a website. I don't use it a whole lot lately. It's just my name, melissacaintravis.com. Where I am most active these days is on Substack. And I have my own Substack account. It's called Music of the Spheres, sphere as in the geometrical shape, SPHERE, Music of the Spheres. But I primarily use that to promote all sorts of excellent content. As far as the place where I do short form writing, that's a sister Substack called Shadowlands Dispatch. So I do philosophical reflections there, some apologetics articles, but I always promote them through my personal Substack Music of the Spheres. And then, of course, Houston Christian University, where I teach all sorts of courses. I'm teaching a course in human origins right now that is just insanely fun.
That
And
sounds
from time
really
to time,
interesting.
it is, yeah, we do the whole thing. We paleoanthropology all the way through the contemporary debate over the historical Adam and Eve. We cover the
Wow.
whole thing in 16 weeks. It's glorious. And from time to time, I teach adult education classes in 8-week blocks for Discovery Institute, where I serve as a fellow at the Center for Science and Culture.
Hmm. Great. And we'll have links to all of that in the show notes for anybody who wants to reach out to follow you guys. So thank you both so much for taking time from your busy schedules to talk with me about your book. And it's just such a wonderful resource. I'm so blessed to have been able to read it. So thank you guys for the work and the love and the ministry that you put into this book.
Thank you, Tanya. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was a wonderful conversation. Hope to see you again.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. Please subscribe for more topics like this, where we focus on bringing our faith and health together for a whole you. If you have questions around your health or your faith, including doubts and struggles with what you've been taught about God, we'd love to have you send us an email at support@psalmmedical.com.